Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Laying Lines podcast. This one is the second part to the Game of Thrones podcast episode, spoiler review edition. So, spoiler warning. Now, this one's probably not going to be as long as the other one because there's not really that many differences for the second half of the book and the show itself. Again, I'm using the show as a medium to relate the Game of Thrones books to the audience that will listen to these reviews. Now, I think my biggest thing about the second half of the book is there's a big there's a big tone difference between the start of the book and the end of the book. And I think the biggest tone difference is that when they kill Eddard, they take on a different tone. Like, at the end of the book, everything seems a bit hopeless after he dies. And it's kind of like the family and everybody around the family kind of take on a sense of holy shit, everything is different, everything's changed now. And this is when we start getting into Robb Stark, Lord Robb Stark, King of the North Robb Stark, and when we get to Tyrion being reunited with his family and um, dragging down the mountain clans to fight alongside the Lannister army when they come in contact with one half of Robb's army on it's either the Fingers or the Trident, one of the two, but they fight next to a river. And this is also when we start seeing a bit of the hopelessness and the desperation when Catelyn is willing to do anything and everything to try to get her son off of the battlefield and to help his army get closer and closer and closer to King's Landing. This is also when we see Arya being taken out onto the King's Road by Yoren and joining up with everybody that he's taking to the wall, and we start seeing the hunt for Robert's bastard children, and we kind of start seeing it all when uh, they this is kind of like a little snippet out of the second book, Clash of Kings, but it relates back to the first one and kind of helps me to add context to the stuff that you'll see. And you start seeing Cersei take over towards the end of the book. And this is also when we're introduced to what is his name? Walder Walder Frey, the guy that runs the twins. This is when we get introduced to him because Catelyn is desperate to get Robb across the twins and towards the Lannister army. So she's willing to do anything and everything and promises that he will marry a girl from his Walder's family. So it's one of those things where you start seeing the desperation because something that I personally think about is that George is really good at portraying mental things for his characters, like their mental states and stuff. And everything seems a bit more grim, especially when uh, Joffrey takes Sansa onto the wall and talks about the spikes, and he's like, your gift is up here. So he takes her up there, and he has the Hound to kind of like escort her up, but she doesn't want to go. But the Hound is just kind of like, well, if you do it now, he's not going to get mad, and he's not going to hit you, or he's not going to have the King's Guard beat the shit out of you. So it'd be better to just go ahead and do it now. So the Hound kind of starts, his mask kind of cracks a little bit, and it shows that he's not the guy that was portrayed at the beginning of the book. And then he just kind of does things out of honor. And then we get a better glimpse at Joffrey in the book, because he shows Sansa the head of her father mounted on a spike on, I think it's called the Gate of the Kings or something like that. And then he goes on, he's like, these last two spikes are for my Uncle Stannis and my Uncle Renly when they are brought to justice or something, because you start to realize that he's been fed like this twisted idea of what justice is by his mother, and he's just he's fucked in the head because of, you realize how much enjoyment he got out of seeing people executed left and right, because on his name day he wanted to execute a guy for being drunk and walking around naked, and Sansa and the Hound kind of convince him to not kill the guy and instead just take his knighthood and make him the court jester so that she could laugh and that Joffrey could laugh because he's a funny looking man or something like that. And I mean, it does, it starts getting more bleak, especially after Tyrion is brought back, and nothing really comes to fruition until the start of the second book, but you can kind of see it at the end of the first book, because Tyrion comes back at the end of the first book as Hand of the King in his father's place, and he's told about how dangerous the roads have gotten and that you really shouldn't walk on them because you're very, very likely to get mugged, and that Lord Tywin just would rather be away from the mess that his grandson had created, and he would rather be out on the field fighting for glory because he feels himself more useful out there than he does back in King's Landing. And that's kind of a glimpse into his mental state, where he sees himself as this glorious warrior and not a diplomat. And this is something else that brings into a view how Cersei is using Joffrey as a puppet, and it's very well executed because of how angry she gets when Tyrion shows up instead of her father showing up or her brother showing up to take place as Hand of the King, because she doesn't have as much power over Tyrion, I guess is how you could put it, or she doesn't have as much sway with him as she would if her father was there. And when Tyrion told her that he was sent there by her father, or by their father, sorry, and she just kind of regrettably accepts the fact that he's there, or angrily accepts the fact that he's there. And beyond that, there's not really much I can say about the last half of the book. But I think over overall, it is one of the better fantasy novels that I've seen. And I think this is because there's a lack of fantastical elements throughout a bulk of the story. And it's mostly because of the book kind of focuses on character building and using the character building to build the world around them. And a lot of other fantasy books, they want to center around they want to center around the fact of, hey, we got magic, or hey, we got dragons. And I mean, Game of Thrones has dragons in it, and I mean, we all know that. And it I think Game of Thrones has one of the best ending lines out of any fantasy novel that I've read, and and that I own. But the book ends it ends in a very nice way, because it ends with Khal Drogo being put on his funeral pyre, and Daenerys tying the witch to the funeral pyre, and she lays the dragon eggs around Khal Drogo, and she lights it ablaze. And when she walks into it, she starts seeing Khal Drogo snapping his whip. And when he snaps the whip, it cracks open an egg. And then it cracks open another egg. And then it cracks open the very last egg. And it ends with, I think it's something like, don't quote me on this, but it ends with something like, for the first time in 100 years, the night was filled with the cry of dragons. Something like that. Like, it was very mysterious. And it kept me hooked. And immediately when I got home, I picked up Clash of the Kings. Or Clash of Kings. And I'm currently reading it. I'm currently reading it. Sorry, I dropped my phone. But I'm currently reading it. And just so you guys know, that's the sound of Clash of Kings being flipped through. And the reason why I will recommend Game of Thrones to everybody is because Game of Thrones is 800 something pages long. 800 something. That is a long book. And I was hooked. I was hooked on the book. From beginning to end, I was hooked on the book. Now, I took a few breaks here and there to read something else, but I always came back and I read it until it was finished. So, my final opinion. Characters, 10 out of 10. World building, 10 out of 10. Useless word count, 7 out of 10. There's some shit that's in there that I would not want to read, but I still read it anyway. Action, 10 out of 10. It kept it subtle, except for where it was needed. Character interactions, 10 out of 10. They interacted with each other like they were real people, and it played out like a movie in my mind. I mean, I saw the show, but the way the book played out was a whole lot better. And that's all I got. I mean, overall, the book, I'll give it like an 8.5, 9.5 out of 10. And like I said, I will recommend it to everybody that's looking to read a fantasy book but doesn't want to read a fantasy book. Because Game of Thrones keeps the fantasy elements light. Most of the stuff that they have that are fantasy elements are considered legend. And it keeps it that way for most of the book. Yeah, you got the White Walkers, but they appear like, once or twice. You got the dragons, but they don't really appear until the end of the book. I mean, most of it they keep away until it's absolutely needed for the story. But overall, that's my review. 10 out of 10. Good to go. Thank you, and I will see you again for another book. It will not be Clash of Kings. It'll be another book. Thank you much.